Welcome back to the Offbit. Today we're going to look at the Core 2 Quad Q8400 system from my last featured video. We're going to run it through some benchmarks and some game titles from 2020. Stick around and we'll see how she runs. Q8400 Core 2 Quad, based on the Yorkfield core released back in April 2009. Its stock frequency is 2.667 GHz, with a front side bus of 1333 MHz, 4 mega cache. It runs on an 8 times multiplier by stock, and it's 4 cores. It's based on the 4nm node with a TDP at 95 watts, and lives in the LGA 775 socket. Our GPU today is the GTX 570 by MSI. This particular version is the MSI Froza 3. It's a Fermi-based GPU, the GF110, released in December 2010. Its core frequency is running at 770 MHz. The RAM clock clocked at 2 GHz, at 1.2 gig of GDDR5 on a 320-bit bus, with DirectX 11 and OpenGL 4.1 support. Thrown in 2 2GB Kingston DDR3 RAM sticks. Gives a total of 4 GB. We have used the Asus P5G41T-M LX from Asus. This is a micro ATX form factor motherboard which was released approximately 2009. I think it could be earlier, maybe later. Northbridge is the G41, Southbridge is the IO Control Hub 7, the front side bus supports a 1333, 1066, 800 MHz, supporting LGA 775 socketed CPUs. Well, first up, we're going to look at the performance of what the CPU can do. So we're just going to run a couple of benchmarks. Well, the CPU ID, we're going to see how it performs in 7-zip and Cinebench score. So our CPU ID single core score was 216.5, the multi-core score of 852.4. Now we ran 7-zip and our single core millions instructions per second score was 2,692 MIPS. The 4-core scoring 9,436 MIPS. Now Cinebench score was 275 for the Q8400, placing him just shy behind the i3-2120 in its performance. Now, interestingly enough, the i3-2120 does have better single core performance scores, but in the multi-thread, the Q8400 did show to pull out in front with most of the benchmarks. And this is because the i3-2120 is basically 2 cores, 4 threads, versus the Q8400, who has a proper 4 solid cores. Alright, we're going to jump into some benchmarking on the GPU. So the GTX 570 running on the Q8400 Core 2 Quad scored 45.01 in Cinebench. As you can see, there is another CPU and GTX 570 sitting there, and we've got 50.28. So I can already say that this CPU is struggling and it is bottlenecking our GTX 570. We also ran 3DMark's Firestrike benchmarking utility. Now our score for Firestrike is 3,687. Alright, we're going to crack into some of the game benchmarks. So first off, in the lineup we have CSGO. Now CSGO, we measured an average frame rate of 57.9 frames per second. The minimum frame rate was 21.5 frames per second. Maximum frame rate was 100.9 frames per second. 1% lows were 16.9 frames per second, and our 0.1% lows was 4.5 frames per second. Now our CPU, it sort of jumped between 60 and almost up to 100% on most of the cores. Some of the cores were at 100%. So CSGO ran alright on the Q8400, but we're starting to climb in the point where it can't handle it. So maybe on some of the bigger maps you might run into more problems. You may have to drop details and things like that. But for most of it, it ran quite fine, and I think anyone probably could game on this quite happily. Next up, we have PUBG. Our average frame rate for PUBG was 37.6 frames per second. Minimum frame rate, we hit 0.2 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate was 63.9 frames per second. Our 1% lows was 0.2 frames per second. And our 0.1% lows at 0.2 frames per second. Now, we have some issues in this game. As you can see that the CPU is struggling the whole time. Every core is basically set at 100%. When we loaded in, I didn't actually get to see the start off area or the plane trip, but eventually at some point after we flew across the map, we were dropped. I didn't see that. At some point it loaded in. Now we did have some other issues with loading. As you can see, very soon we'll be driving through an area on this motorbike, and you can see some of the detail on the actual models start becoming very low, and at one point we fall through the map. So just flying along here. So yeah, this is unplayable. CPU is completely holding it back, and basically this would be a terrible experience. At times it's playable, but most of it was terrible. Alright, keep on going with the Battle Royale theme. So we jumped into Fortnite. Now, Fortnite had a very similar sort of problem to what we had with PUBG. CPU sitting always 100%, so we're bottlenecking like crazy. But let's check out what our frame rates were. Our average frame rate was 70.3 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate was 0.7 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate was 92.6 frames per second. Our 1% lows were 0.7 frames per second. And our 0.1% lows were also 0.7 frames per second. Now this, I think, shows that our GPU is more than capable of running this, but the CPU is just falling behind. As you can see, all the glitching, all the model problems, it's just not loading the area in. It's just too much. Now we did try to run Apex Legends, but because the Core 2 Quad doesn't support SSE 4.2 instructions, we get an error running the game, and that's as far as we get. Okay, next up we have Overwatch. Our average frame rates for Overwatch was 45.8 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate was 0.4 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate, we came in at 69.7 frames per second. Our 1% lows were 2.9 frames per second, and our 0.1 lows were 0.4 frames per second. Overall, Overwatch was playable. It was not enjoyable, where at times it would slow down, generally when there was lots happening, and that's a big problem when you're playing these type of competitive games. And I think mainly the GPU has been bottlenecked by the CPU once again. We tried running Overwatch at 720p. Now, it definitely made it go a little bit more smoother, better frame rate, sort of bumped that up. But the CPU, as you can see, generally sat pretty high, so there's a bottleneck still happening with the CPU. Gameplay-wise, Overwatch ran a lot better at 720p on the Q8400. Last up today is Minecraft Bedrock Edition, or also known as Minecraft Windows 10 Edition, the one we're running anyway. So our average frame rate was 59.9 frames per second, minimum frame rate 57.9, maximum frame rate was 60.4, 1% lows at 57.9, and 0.1% lows were 24.9. Quite an enjoyable experience. This thing runs perfectly fine. The CPU kind of sat pretty high with the percentages, but I don't think it bottlenecked too much, and it wasn't all that noticeable. And to wrap up everything today, the Q8400 for 2020 is not really something you want to be gaming on. It generally spent most of its time sitting at 100% in most of the games, with a couple of older titles like CSGO and Minecraft Bedrock, which is kind of a revamp of an older title. It's a very easy game for the CPU to crunch. It runs on a potato. So my advice, if you want to be gaming, don't go with a Q8400 for 2020 unless you like bottlenecks. Well, that's basically it for the Offbeat today. Now, if you like this video, do remember to like. And there is also a subscribe button down there if you want to see more content. Well, until next time, we'll see you on the Offbeat.